Hi, I'm Danielle Merfeld with GE Renewable Energy. I'm joined by Alejandro Moreno from the Department of Energy and Debbie Mursch from GE Renewables Hydro. Looking forward to a great discussion about the future of energy and the position that hydro is in.
Sure, and thanks for having me here today. It's been fun moving from being the director of the Water Power Technologies Office, where I oversaw the hydropower portfolio, and now being the Deputy Assistant Secretary for all of renewable power. Really, it's my job to think through where hydro and other technologies fit in the bigger picture. And it's clear that hydropower has a potentially really unique role as one of the only sources of firm, flexible generation. So generation that's really dispatchable, it's there whenever you need it, but that's also renewable. And completely clean. It's not to say that there aren't other potential environmental impacts that we know about hydropower, and both of my agency and your company are hard at work in ensuring that the hydro that we have today continues to improve its environmental performance. But we know that hydro is an absolutely critical sort of force multiplier, maybe, or integrator of variable renewables like wind and solar. And I think as we see more and wind and solar get on the system, we're likely to see hydro's value be more and more recognized in that way.
That's awesome. And Debbie, I've learned so much from you about hydro and how it fits into the system over the last few years. What's your big take on, given everything that we're hearing in the public across so many different governments and agencies about investment in the new energy sector, the future of the energy sector. How does hydro fit into that from your perspective?
Well, actually, thanks, Danielle. Actually, I'm quite excited about it, especially I'll give a plug for Alejandro in that he is working with IHA and setting up a forum to really address that issue as well as others. What really has been amazing, though, with my involvement with the IHA session and specifically the Pump Storage Forum, is that many of the issues that I saw here in the United States, I thought was just a US issue. And it was amazing how consistent the issues are across the world. For example, lack of equitable incentives, lack of financing, lack of proper market signals, not valuing all the benefits that pump storage brings. And I just never dreamt that it was universal. And I think the best thing on the forum is that we are learning in places that it is working. For example, in Israel, Gilboa specifically was the first IPP that actually was able to get the financial model to work, get the funding. And so it's things like that that we're trying to learn from around the world and, really share best practices. So thanks to you, Alejandro, for spearheading that and helping fund it to make it happen. I don't know if you have any other comments about it, but I'm certainly excited about what we've done so far.
No, I'm glad to hear that. Certainly, the more we worked with our partners internationally, the more we recognize that a lot of the issues that hydropower and pump storage in particular, and really all forms of storage at this point, are facing from a market standpoint. It's easy if you're looking from a particular technology to think, well, the markets aren't valuing my services all that well. But the reality is the power system's changing, and what we are going to need in a power system that's dominated by very low to zero marginal cost variable generation is somewhat different. And some of the type of flexibility that you get from all forms of storage, from dispatchable generation like hydropower, certainly from long duration storage, it's clear that it's going to be very valuable, but the revenue streams and the exact dispatch patterns are harder to predict. And so as we know, the markets and the project finance structure that a lot of our projects are based on aren't always well equipped to deal with that. And so it's great to see that at the same time there's some of these challenges, that there are a lot of organizations coming together to looking at how either regulatory orders or market products can be improved to reflect these values, regardless of who provides them. So, and that's happening in the US and abroad. Sorry, Danielle.
No, that's okay. It really feels like, as you're saying that, it really feels like it plays into this idea of, there's just chapters of the transition that we're going through. And it's easy to imagine that the one you're in is the big thing that's going to change it all. And, LCOE, prices are coming down, and how dramatic wind and solar pricing has happened, what's happened over the last decade. It felt like that was the story. And then when they become close to the marginal cost of running a conventional power plant, then it's what about capacity? What about flexibility? And all of a sudden, the next chapter of, ancillary services and value for capacity. And then that feels like the whole game. And in parts of my role, it's about, regionalization and connecting, regions so that you don't see the same climate issues or weather patterns in the same place. Do you think that some of what lithium ion price reductions and how that has created a discourse around the value of energy storage, has that helped the hydro storage story or even just awareness of the value of that in the market?
That's a really good question. I honestly, I don't know the answer to what extent. I mean, certainly it hasn't hurt the recognition and the ability of large, 100 megawatt lithium ion based plants like the Tesla plant have certainly helped raise the awareness of the possibilities of storage. But I think just as big a driver is the recognition of the need, that as you start modeling scenarios that have more and more variable renewables on the system, things like the California duck curve were around and prompting discussion, I think, before you saw the significant price decrease in lithium ion. The good news is we have a lot of different technology options. Lithium ion is one of them, and certainly the costs are coming down quickly. But there are a range of technologies that provide different types of capabilities, whether it's quick response or storage itself. And it's really going to be it's going to take a portfolio, right? Lithium ion right now is predominantly being manufactured for the vehicle market, but within the grid, looking at sort of 4 hours or less. Not to say that technology improvements and cost reductions couldn't make it valuable for longer duration, but there are a number of other technologies as well, including pump storage, of course, that are really well suited, ideally suited for longer duration applications. And so it's that mix that's exciting. I'm curious to follow up on something you just said as well about some of the regional differences. Certainly, one of the differences of our jobs is my primary focus is on the US and GE is a global company. We certainly see probably somewhat different regional pathways towards getting increased decarbonization in the power sector, just based on individual regional needs and preferences, as well as the technology mix. I'm wondering to what extent you see that and you see the differences in generation mix or differences in load profile making a difference in what type of technology and technology mixes you see utilities or communities choosing where you work.
Well, I'll give you my perspective, but I'd love to hear Deb's perspective as well, just seeing where hydro is in demand and what our teams are trying to innovate around. But, diversity is the king. And I think given that hydropower has had a lot more installed capacity than wind or solar for so long, it was sort of the capable friend that you already had. And now you're out making new friends, bringing new things onto the grid. So I just think it's going to be a cycle. Things will fall in and out of favor based on how rarefied they are and what our mix is. But definitely, Alejandro, you're absolutely right. Around the world, we're seeing different regions, of course, based on resource availability and, access to access to labor. Ultimately, you got to build these projects no matter what kind of resource it is. But there's definite trends for where hydro or wind or solar or energy storage fit in. And I think the pieces that are most interesting to me are the crises points, the flash points, whether it's Australia or, the duck curve in California. You start to see solutions emerge, sometimes not such a great economically driven solution, but sometimes the fastest solution or the most politically popular solution. And then it kind of gets smarter and you narrow in on the right choices for that environment. And then everybody else that watched that happen can learn. So even very volatile situations where governments or regions are moving fast to deploy fast deployable things like wind and solar, they're actually able to learn, I think, better about the mix. And that's going to be the most interesting piece going forward, is what have we learned and how is that being shared so that the whole, enterprise is investing in that ecosystem at the right level. Debbie, what do you see around the world in terms of that mix?
Well, the one thing too that I think we can't forget about is the effects of climate change and what that's doing, because one of the concerns I have is that a lot of times that we model on averages and we're not taking into account with these generation models that the ISOs do at dispatching, is that they're planning on averages and not these outlying data points, such as what happened in Texas, such as what we're starting to see in California. And one of the things that we've been doing is kind of collecting throughout the world all these anomalies, and to make sure that we do a root cause analysis and lessons learned, because if we don't start learning from what's happening and understanding how it perhaps could have been prevented and root cause analysis, I'm just concerned we're never going to get there, especially when we keep adding on intermittent renewables.
Mm-hmm.
Debbie, your point of modeling often being at sort of annual or monthly averages is really important, because as we all know, the power system doesn't run on averages. The power system runs on instantaneous change. And whether you're talking about the effects of climate change, or you're talking about the effects of differences in diurnal load patterns, or even clouds passing overhead, that's the time frame that we have to ensure reliability and resilience to the system. This is a big part of what DOE is really starting to look at now, is improving our modeling ability, the time scale of models, as well as the data that we have on what types of change at what time scales are likely to be the biggest drivers in both the technology deployment, but also the operational strategies that you use for the power system. And being able to build those capabilities that allow us to incorporate changes as we learn more. I mean, if we start right now and just assume we know everything about the power system or all the external exogenous factors that are going to drive it, and we'll just model that perfectly as well as we can, we know we're going to fail, because we know that we only are scratching the surface with the actual knowledge of what the future will hold. But being able to develop the capabilities and really taking advantage of some of the advances in computing power that we've seen at the labs and globally over the last decade, to be able to build that capability, almost a resilient model to model the resilience, right? I just came up with that. I want to trademark on that phrase. But really very much to understand, well, as we learn more about, to use an example really relevant for hydro, how is climate change likely to affect both seasonal and temporal and daily patterns of water flow? That's going to have a big role on hydropower. It's going to have a big role on the amount of water available for hydropower dispatch, and probably even the relative dispatch between hydropower, irrigation, drinking water. How do we start thinking about that now? And how do we develop the capabilities that allow us to understand as we learn more and get more sophistication in our modeling capabilities of water flows to translate that back into power system impacts? We don't have all the answers yet, but these are the types of questions that DOE is really starting to tackle.
I love hearing that, Alejandro, because water not only is obviously a really important part of the hydro solution, but it's used in a lot of other power. Gas power generation uses water. We're using water in a lot of other ecosystems and a lot of other sectors that are connected to energy but aren't energy. So, that's a nexus point that these kind of studies, I think, could really give us a much more holistic view. I have to share, just last week, I learned something that was really, it kind of threw me for a loop and is making me think a little differently about energy solutions in general. And it was from California Energy Commission chair had shared that last year during some of the hardest times in California, during the fires, and they're worried about rolling blackouts or brownouts. And there was this request sent out for people to, reduce their load and voluntarily take their own load use down, or their own electricity use down. And they measured that at the substation, maybe, or the feeder. I can't remember how he said they measured it, but it was a lot of small changes that made a big impact. And it saved them potentially from crossing a threshold that would have made it even more difficult to keep the system balanced and performing. And so that's a way to think about load management. But when I think about hydro, the first thing that pops into my head is there's a lot of really small hydro systems distributed around the country that might be in disrepair, or might just be mostly there for other purposes, irrigation. It happens to have some power capability in it. What's the value, not just in spite of them being small, but because they're small and distributed? Are we thinking about hydro resources broadly enough, or are we just thinking about massive high power systems when maybe there's value for this broader view of what hydro can do on a network?
I know speaking for DOE, we're thinking of both, absolutely. We're actually explicitly looking at some of these alternate value propositions for small hydro in particular. There's you've seen such a wide range of value propositions, from those, of course, that you think about irrigation and other water use, but even things like historic preservation. We've seen hydro developers get higher above market PPAs for their contribution to historic development in old canals, for example, on the East Coast. Mm-hmm. But one of the areas I think we're absolutely focused on pretty extensively is looking at the interplay of hydropower and irrigation modernization. Traditionally, hydropower has been a linchpin in many cases of modernizing irrigation systems because of the revenue it provides. A little bit less so as power prices have decreased, but certainly there's the potential for a lot of on-site renewable power that can power the electrification of farm equipment that's not plugged into the grid. But also we've found in working with irrigation districts in the West the potential to generate clean renewable power to put more water back upstream, which of course is good for hydropower, but also good for the ecosystem and good for efficient water use, and also save money in irrigation districts and individual farmers and water customers. And those are the types of solutions where some of the type of work that we're looking at and then the capabilities we at DOE have traditionally developed for the power system, and of course, we're the Department of Energy. That at least in the Applied Energy Office, that's our number one focus. But we recognize that they have benefits that cascade down to other uses in agriculture and drinking water. And one of the values of hydropower is that by definition, it sits at the intersection of the power system and multiple different water sectors. And so if we are improving some of that infrastructure, we need to be thinking about how to optimize that improvement for the ultimate end users. We're the same people, whether they're turning on their lights or turning on their faucet. So
fantastic.
You a question, Danielle.
Oh, sure.
A couple of years ago, we had, as you'll recall, the Water Power Innovation Council meeting. And you were one of the speakers to the hydro industry. We had a couple hundred people there from the hydro industry. And one of the things that you basically told the hydro industry is get your act together.
I didn't use those words, though.
I know you didn't.
I might have said.
But you were showing how the cost curves for wind and solar and batteries were coming down, and you were comparing them to us in hydro. And I totally agree. I mean, our costs are, if not stable, increasing. And some of the people in the room were saying that they were even having problems justifying releasing hydro, that it was really cheaper to do other technologies. And I know we can learn a lot. You're looking at the whole spectrum, and I guess is it still so bad? I mean, that was a couple of years ago. Are the cost curves still decreasing so quickly? And if you have any words of wisdom for us, I think it'd be interesting to the audience.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to share. So solar and wind and now lithium ion energy storage are continuing their relentless dive in costs, which is a good thing. And I think it might also be good for hydro, because what they're doing is they're setting up a framework for how to build a lot of energy on the grid, but they don't provide, except for what you can get out of a lithium ion energy system, which is right now, the sweet spot is between 1 and 4 hours of storage. So what they don't provide is the capacity, and to some degree, limited in flexibility. Now, I will say you can do a lot with power electronics, and there's a ton of innovation on the grid just by regionalizing and connecting bigger regions and optimizing, from a software and controls level at the distribution layer. So there's a lot you can do with managing loads and using all that wind and solar, all that variable power in a better way. However, there is a place for hydro, and it doesn't have to meet the CapEx costs of wind or solar to compete, because I know most of the folks listening would be able to give us a long reasoning why hydro has, if you look at it from another angle, hydro is actually very low cost given the life of a system, the amount, the lower operational costs. I mean, there's a lot of really good things about hydro too. So I think the key for us to think about a unified energy system isn't to compare everything on one or two sets of aspects or type, reasons, but we have to look at the whole system together and how do they fit together? What's the complementary nature of hydro and wind and solar and storage and gas and everything else that exists already? Because that's where you find the sweet spots for where it's valuable. And ultimately, that's where the industry then can go and innovate for that application or that feature, which gives me a lot of hope that we're going to see a significant amount of hydro in our future.
And Alejandro, we at this, and thank you, Danielle. Alejandro, as you know, a couple of years ago, we got a small group together and just kind of brainstormed, what possibly could we do. And one of the things was the target of a 50% cost reduction, 50% lead time schedule. Any thoughts on that? Is that a pipe dream, or is there hope?
Without specifically answering your question, I'm going to dodge the very last bit, but that conversation did result in our fast commissioning challenge from DOE, which specifically looked at technologies that could bring down the commissioning cost of pump storage, the building cost by 50%. And we had, as you were part of the panel, so you're aware, I recall you were pretty excited by some of the construction techniques in particular that came out of that. But what I would say, in echoing Danielle, what you said, I think you hit it, really right on, where, we are so used to thinking of electrons as a commodity. Every electron is the same, and for a long time that was pretty much the case, that they could all be generated, and what really mattered, drove the value, was when they were being used. But that's less and less true, where different generation technologies have really different properties, both in terms of the grid services they can provide and the availability to generate when on command. And so what that means is comparing costs, levelized cost across technologies isn't the whole story, and in many cases isn't it's not the best way to understand whether a technology is viable commercially or valuable to the grid. And it's really being able to compare the cost of a particular technology or the generation to the value that provides, which is a combination of the overall amount of energy, but when the energy is coming on, and what are the ancillary services that technology can provide as well. And that's where hydro really shines, where it has relatively low cost energy itself, but it is completely on demand, and it offers a range of flexibility that's unsurpassed by any other generation technology out there. So, I tend to believe what Danielle, you said very much, that there's a big role for hydro, and bringing down costs is always really helpful, but that's only half the story.
So the other piece to me feels like it's a little bit mix of risk aversion and financing and permitting. Where's the next big hurdle for hydro? What is the biggest issue that they face today? Besides, of course, that whole, compete on cost with something in a completely different realm.
Well, I'm really curious to hear your take on this. You probably have a better sense, or at least closer to the ground than I do. But certainly the things that we're looking at the most. I think Debbie, you made this point before, but really understanding what are the sort of financial products or the market mechanisms that can provide incentives and certainty for the type of capacity we're talking about, recognizing that the exact generation patterns and the revenue streams are really hard to predict. And that's a model that we're not always used to building on, or when we do, we have PPAs, but realizing that at some point, we're looking at maybe more holistic structures. And so, as Debbie, you referenced Israel. I apologize, I have some sirens going on
for you, Alejandro.
The beauty of working from home. But looking, and this is where getting global experience, and you mentioned this International Pump Storage Forum. One of the things we are looking at are what are some of the financing mechanisms, what are some of the policy mechanisms that have been put in place that have resulted in deployment. And it's not right now, DOE tends to stay away from sort of recommending specific policy mechanisms, because that really depends on the risk tolerance and the goals of individual policymakers. But certainly being able to understand what are the impacts and what are the mechanisms that have been proven to bring down risk. We have 3 pump storage projects with a license in the US right now all of them are looking for ways to make their revenue stream more certain so that they can get financing. What are some of the ways that have worked in other countries to actually be able to take some of that risk? And we've seen countries, whether they are countries where the government tends to play a large role in the power sector or not, and we've seen pump storage being developed in many of those countries. And so being able to learn from them is very valuable, regardless of whether or not we end up replicating the exact mechanisms here.
So whenever I have questions about this, I ask Debbie, so you've got to give us your perspective on this.
The other thing is we're finding is even within the PPAs, they're still very slanted to short duration storage. You take, and I'm going to use a battery. Okay, how does pump storage compare to a battery versus how does a battery compare to pump storage? And so I think we're getting there in, again, having a level playing field on technology comparisons, but we're still not there yet. And we're continuing to see that in these PPAs that are coming out, that they're still slanted to short duration storage. And it's almost a learning process. And we do try to talk with the people and tell them how to kind of get a leveler playing field, but we're still not there yet. So again, it's the whole financial model that's kind of, I think we brought down all the other barriers like the licensing, et cetera, but this is the one major one left, I believe. So.
And I don't know if this is a barrier or not, but I know we have had areas where we're doing innovation in hydro, and we might even have done some good amount of development, but getting a partner or a customer to want to try it out feels like a barrier sometimes. When it works, why does it work? And I'd love maybe both of you guys to give me a perspective, because I'm sure you've seen, Alejandro, you've seen people innovate in this space for a long time. And Deb, you've seen our own examples. What do you guys think? What makes it work when it works? Deb?
Maybe I'll let you lead on that one.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I've grown up in this industry, and it's interesting because I see the hydro industry so much more conservative than I do in steam, nuclear, coal. And it's interesting because they're the same customers, the big utilities. So that's a number one. I saw them being much more aggressive, trying out gas turbines, being serial number one with new designs. But when we're talking about hydro, even something simple that's not a new gas turbine, which is compared to just little things, it's just very difficult to get the what I call the big boys, the regulated utilities and also the government to try new things. And what's interesting is that where we are seeing people willing to try new things are the ones that have the most to lose. They don't have the bandwidth, and they don't have the financial wherewithal to take these risks that they are, and yet they're wanting to do it because they see the benefit to the industry. So I don't know how we overcome that. I think our biggest issue is that we can't show it. We can only show it in the labs. It's very difficult to get anybody to raise their hand to say, hey, can we use your major unit to test our new technology? So that's another thing. If we could get government help to maybe use the Army or Bureau, some of the ones that aren't used so much, that would really be of help if we could do full scale testing of new technology.
Alejandro, what do you think?
So Alejandro, could you do that for us?
I'm not going to speak for my friends and colleagues at the Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation, but I hear what you're saying. And certainly, this has been one of the big catch-22s in hydro development. Even, of course, with environmental technology or technology specifically designed to improve the environmental performance, in order to be able to deploy it and utilize it, you need to be able to prove that it has the effect that it should in the real world. But in order to get it in the real world and prove that effect, of course, you need to get the permit for it. And that creates a really difficult challenge. And it's nobody's fault. It's a structural issue. There are bodies whose sole purpose is to protect the habitat where hydro facilities are located, and you can't blame them for being skeptical and hesitating to put something in the water that they don't have proof will work. But it does lead to a situation where there's no way to actually prove the efficacy of a particular technology and get the data that you really need for investors to move beyond just the first of a kind. We are working right now in DOE on a sort of a report looking at the potential for a hydropower test facility. That was something that Congress asked us to do this year. We'll see what the results of that are. Part of the challenge, as we know, is that hydro in general is so customized and so heterogeneous that it's really hard to develop one facility that can do everything. But if there are areas or specific types of technologies that are really suffering the most from a lack of ability to get them in a realistic environment and test them, that's the type of input actually is really useful. So I pitched for anybody listening to this to give us your input on what the sort of parameters of a test facility would be to make it as useful as possible. But really understand and really, the other approach is partnerships and working with individual companies that are willing, for whatever reason, whatever sort of structure that they have, to be able to take a little bit more risk and be able to try things that haven't been tried before. And that's the other approach, which, as you both know, it can work quite well. So.
I couldn't imagine a better call to action for us to end on, Alejandro. Thank you for that. And especially in the idea of innovation is going to be necessary across the whole energy sector, and hydro is no different. So how are we going to help that innovation keep it relevant and growing while we transform the energy sector? So thanks for joining us today. And thank you, Debbie. It's been great talking with both of you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Good to see you both.
Good to see you too.